I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. This is a companion piece to my recent episode on necromancy. You may want to go check out that episode first. You'll find a link in the card above. But this conversation between I and Brian Johnson was just wonderful to have. Johnson, as you probably know, is the translator of the recent volume Necromancy in the Medici Library, and he gives us some really wonderful insights into the process of translation, some different ideas around the practice of necromancy at this time, but also just the sort of ins and outs and nuts and bolts of what makes a translation work, including the work of teaching yourself Latin, teaching yourself some paleography, and then just diving into a text to render it from Latin into English. I'll certainly say that Johnson's translation is very well done, and it's really a testimony to the fact that you can really double down and learn this stuff yourself, and you can really produce some really fine work. So I hope you'll enjoy this conversation between myself and Brian Johnson on his recent work on the necromantic text in the Medici Library. And of course, I'd like to extend a thanks to Brian and to the folks at Hadean Press for providing me with an advance copy of the book. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Well, hi everyone. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge. Welcome to Esoterica. I hope you've had the chance to take a look at my episode on the Medici Necromancy Manual, and I'm really excited to have a conversation today with the translator of those really neat excerpts, Brian Johnson, who's done this really amazing and very accessible text that's given us a really cool insight into the practice of necromancy there in the late 15th century. Brian Johnson is an independent scholar. He's a freelance editor and a research consultant, and he's a translator of historical documents pertaining to the occult. His work is largely concerned with reconstructing the esoteric worldviews and practices of historical individuals based on primary source documents. And of course, it doesn't get much more primary source than looking at an actual manuscript of a necromancer there in the Medici Library. So, Brian, I really appreciate you coming on to chat with me today, and welcome to this conversation here on Esoterica.
Thank you for having me.
So, Brian, let's jump right into it. One doesn't end up randomly translating Necromancer's Manual. There's a story there, right? There's always a story about how you end up translating something like a book of black magic from the 15th century. Could you tell us a little bit about your background, how you got the skills to do this kind of work? Because it's a very specialized kind of thing, and so I'm sure folks are curious about sort of your academic background, your training, and how you got the skill set to do this kind of work.
Well, the practical skills as far as dealing with manuscripts, in my case, I'm entirely self-taught. My academic background is actually in anthropology and archaeology. I was actually an archaeological field technician for 6 years after college. This is really just kind of a hobby of mine. Uh, I do have some formal training in Koine Greek from college, but my Latin is entirely self-taught. And as far as uh, my paleography skills are entirely a matter of trial and error. I find it's kind of like riding a bike, except every manuscript is a different bike.
I think that's a great analogy. You know, I've worked with some manuscripts myself, and I've done an episode on the sort of work that goes into transcribing these. And yeah, they can really range from relatively clear, like the Italian humanist hand that it's in the Medici text, to just an incomprehensible mess sometimes, like I mentioned before we got started with John Dee's later handwriting, or something in between, like the Munich Necromancer's Manual, which is, as long as you understand Latin pretty well and the abbreviations isn't too bad, but that's also saying a lot. Um, Brian, could you give folks tips about? I'm sure there are lots of folks out there who are really interested, and I get emails often like, "How do I get into studying these kinds of texts? How do I get into doing these kinds of things?" And we're living in an age where one of the really cool things about the Medici Manual is that it's completely digitized in really high resolution photographs, and you can access it online and with the right skill set. And it's amazing to know that you've taught yourself and given yourself that skill set that you can read it at some level, at a high level, do the translation work. What kind of tips might you give for folks out there who are interested in doing this kind of really primary source archival style work, specifically with magical manuscripts there from the Middle Ages?
Well, again, I can't offer a whole lot of advice as far as formal training. I mean, like I say, there are books like Wheelock's Latin,
Mhm.
which is what I basically use to get myself started. I'm not, and I can't necessarily recommend that as the best source. I really have no frame of reference to go by. Um, as far as actually accessing the manuscripts, there are a lot of university libraries uh, that have these texts in their archives, and over the past 5 years or so, have really stepped up their digitization. Um, really, yeah, I would say start with secondary sources, dealing with medieval magic, or whatever period and geographic region you happen to be interested in. Uh, Start looking at footnotes. You'll see a lot of manuscripts referenced there, and beyond that point, it's really largely a matter of just Googling, and that will most often get you to the repository where any given manuscript can be found, and if it's available in a digital format, you can just go from there.
And how about going about things like getting the rights to publish the translation work? Anything tips there? I'm sure that you got help with the folks at the Medici Library. Was that a difficult thing to the hoops to jump through, or how does it go with even getting the right to publish that kind of stuff?
Well, it's typically as long as you're not reproducing photographic images of the manuscript,
Mm,
there really is no barrier to simply producing a transcription or translation of what's in the text itself. So that uh, really has not been a problem.
right. Because I guess they're like, I mean, they're hundreds of years old. They're in the public domain.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
text is, the images aren't, obviously.
Right, right. And what I've done in my edition here, rather than there are a few images pertaining to the like magical circles and that sort of thing. So we've actually just contracted an artist to reproduce those rather than using the images from the text itself, which has the added benefit of making them much more legible.
Right. No, that's one thing that I noticed that's different between the Medici text and CLM 849 is that the scribe of CLM 849 clearly was a draftsperson. They were definitely using geometric tools to draw their magic circles, whereas clearly whoever wrote the Medici text was doing them freehand and not always terribly elegant.
Yes.
Um, which I don't know. I wonder if demons care much about elegance. If you're summoning Paimon and your circles aren't really that great, I wonder if he just like disgusted with you. It's like, look at this amateurish attempt at doing magic circles. I'm not taking the time today with this guy.
Yeah, I like to think that what's in the book itself was used more as a mnemonic for a quick reference later on.
Right, right. Yeah, and it's always funny that these devices often get, sometimes crudely drawn, and of course, the what's we call it, the orthographic disparities from manuscript to manuscript about magical incantations and demonic names is a whole nother ball of wax. How
Yeah.
necromancers parse that stuff, I don't know. How'd you get into translating books of magic? Because you've also worked on a recension of the Testament of Solomon, which is also a quasi magical text. I mean, one, I can imagine they just sort of sell themselves. I mean, they're medieval books of magic. What's not to like? But What led you to working on the text that you've worked on?
Uh, the I think what drew me to these two in particular, like I say, this is really just kind of a hobby of mine. It's something I'm interested. I've been interested in, magic and the supernatural since I was a little kid.
Mm.
It just never went away. um, what drew me to these in particular and made me think that they might be worth, doing something with and putting into the public domain in a more accessible form, uh, is really their uniqueness within their respective traditions.
Mhm.
Both recensioncy of the Testament of Solomon and this present manuscript, they both contain elements that are really unlike almost anything else found in similar texts. And I think that makes them valuable for purposes of trying to reconstruct a fuller picture of what those traditions may have actually looked like as practiced in
Mhm.
history.
Yeah, that's a super fascinating aspect that I think I tried to touch on a good bit. And the episode that's the companion to this episode is kind of dispelling some of the myths that we've inherited from H.P. Lovecraft or Dungeons and Dragons about necromancers. That when we actually look at their manuscripts, it's surprising that their actual practice often doesn't look quite like what we might imagine from Hollywood or Hammer films or whatever.
Mm. Of course, sometimes it does. There's a lot of blood sacrifice and whatnot. But
Yeah, poor doves, man. Poor doves.
yeah.
Yeah, or the dogs in heat that you have to write your incantations on their flesh, and that's pretty grisly stuff. About how long did it take you, Brian, to produce the volume here? How long did that translation take you? Just to give folks out there, it's one of these important things where I really encourage people to not pirate people's work. That this stuff ends up on whatever library thing on a PDF, and I always tell people, look, maybe with the exception of those bastards at Brill, and even then, ILL it. But I really think it's important for folks to know how much work goes into this kind of thing. And you're a self-taught scholar, teaching yourself Latin is no easy task. Working with original sources is no easy task, and the labor time that you put into this is also no easy task. So just let us know how much time went into this.
Well, in this case, the pandemic did me a favor. I was able to devote basically all of my working time from uh, about April through July of last year,
Okay.
uh, and that was about it. I was wrapped up by about the end of July and sent it off to the publisher.
Okay. I mean, yeah, it's one of these things where it's having an interest and having a pandemic to give you the time. But April to July is no small amount of time. That's a lot of work that goes into this kind of thing. Transcribing it, reading it, going word by word,
Yeah,
having to decipher sometimes the handwriting or having to decipher the transcription errors. Which when I was looking at the manuscript, it's interesting that the writer seems to really get things that these sort of these the scribe or the writer seems to really flip letters around a whole lot, which is interesting. They may have been
I noticed
dyslexic or
that.
something.
Yeah, I off the top of my head, I don't remember if I left that in the final uh, manuscript of my introduction, but it had occurred to me that he might have been dyslexic. Yeah.
Yeah, that's I got the same feeling because it's the kind of errors. I'm a calligrapher, and so I copy a lot of stuff, and I zone out when I do it sometimes because it's kind of a meditative practice for me, and I make the same kind of errors. But when you see them happen that much, one begins to think, oh yeah, this person may have had something like dyslexia because it seems to happen I don't know, a good amount in the text,
Yeah,
more
enough
than
to
usual.
notice.
Yeah, enough to notice. And weird places that you wouldn't expect it, like the beginning of words and stuff like that sometimes.
hmm
So yeah, just something I also noticed when I was flipping through it, looking at the text as well. Um, yeah. So what about these sort of as a hobby, right? I guess it's you described that you've had an interest in sort of magic and the supernatural from a young age, and I guess that can naturally drift in the direction of being interested in these kinds of manuscripts. Could you maybe paint a little fuller picture about sort of how you went from there to there. I'm sure folks kind of are interested in that in that journey, because it's, again, no one ends up translating necromancers manuals accidentally. There's a story there. So curious about more of the story there.
Yeah, I mean, well, curiosity was really just a lot of it. I mean, like I say, I like anyone else, I started out reading the secondary literature. People like Frank Clausen,
Mm.
Claire Fanger, um, and you come across you just like an offhand reference to something that sounds interesting, and you go looking for it,
Mhm.
and you find out that no one else has practically touched it.
Right.
So then it's kind of left up to you if you really want to know what's in that book, you kind of have to do it yourself.
That's absolutely right. I mean, and I think this is one of the things that maybe people don't really realize out there is how much archival work there is to be done. I always give the example of the Munich Necromancer's manual CLM 849. It's not even listed in many of the early magical lists of manuscripts that we get by Lynn Thorndike and people like that. I mean, Lynn Thorndike really did an exhaustive analysis even of that library and missed CLM 849. It wasn't until Kiefer came along later and ultimately rendered it. And so I suspect there's a lot more work out there to be done. And so kudos to you for not just being curious, but doing the damn thing. So
Well, and about speaking of undiscovered manuscripts, I mean, a lot of that is probably down to their descriptions in the library catalogs,
that's right.
because as I think you mentioned in your previous video on this book, that it's in the catalog listed as a book on geomancy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, a bundle, right? A fasciculus.
Yeah,
Yeah, and it's. I think and again, I think this has a lot to do with the history, the accident of this stuff. I worked in some archives where you would just get, because a lot of these magical manuals are not straightforward narratives, right? They're bundles of things, like, again, a fasciculus, right? They really are just sort of a recipe book of how to resurrect a dead guy, how to summon a demon, how to make someone fall in love with you, sort of, kind of a grab bag. And I think when these books sometimes got cataloged, someone just opened them up and whatever they saw first, right? They're like De Amore, and it gets shelved as De Amore, and you're like, this book has nothing to do with that. So I think it has so much to do with the accident of history and things like that.
yeah,
So yeah, it's not just even the translation work; it's also just sort of going into the shelves and looking at these texts. Which, I mean, I was looking through the Medici Library to find the text, and I was just shocked how many manuscripts are in that collection. Um,
yeah.
it's just, it really is mind-boggling. Really is mind-boggling. So why did you pick the excerpts that you picked? Now, as I mentioned in the episode, we're looking at a volume of about 325 folios or so. It's a pretty substantial volume, and there's a lot of really neat stuff in there. Why did you pick what you picked for reasons of creating the volume that you did?
Uh, Almost the same reasons that I had for choosing the manual, this this manual and the Testament of Solomon in the first place. Uh, I think I say in my introduction it was novelty and analogy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I wanted to explore new textual ground, material that had not been published elsewhere, and that's fulfilled by things like the handbook on astrologically timing your demon conjurations, for example. But I also wanted to try to demonstrate how this material fits within a wider context of intellectual tradition and textual transmission.
Mm-hmm.
And we can see that in a handful of the operations that, as you also mentioned, share a lot of DNA with the Munich handbook.
Right, which meant they had to cross the Alps, which is a really interesting thing, considering those books are probably, at least in the manuscript, are probably not more than 50 years apart in terms of transmission history, which is super interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
that's what I thought.
yeah. And what do you make of the fact that you know, again, if we, and one of the things you point out in your edition that I think is really right is that we have evidence of the compiler or the author or whatever we want to call them, right, editing the manuscript probably as a result of them engaging in these experimenta. And I think the word experimenta really is so much. I really like using that word as opposed to using the word spell, because the word experimenta gives us the sense that they're doing this and learning from it, as opposed to the word spell, like casting a spell and either works or it doesn't. And I think the idea that the necromancer or whoever is writing this is like actually changing things along the way. And what's interesting to me about that is that it seems like the very section that you mentioned, right? The astrological section, the section there on what might get called, I suppose, astro necromancy, a la Cecca Dascoli or Michael Scott or something like that. What's interesting is that the demonic catalog gets sort of transmitted, perhaps, or that kind of stuff gets transmitted ultimately into texts like the Goetia and the Lesser Key of Solomon. But it would seem like this astrological section would be incredibly important if you're practicing the business, right? That you would want to do things in the correct way. And what's interesting is how it's completely missing from although it's in Vire, it's very different, right? And it's completely missing from the Lesser Key of Solomon, which I think is just, again, just any thoughts on that? Why you think that some things get picked up and some things don't? Or, and of course, it's not linear, right? We're looking. It could be the case that Vire and the CLM and all these other texts are using another layer of manuscripts that we've completely lost or been destroyed. So, any sense of any theories or even speculation as to why you think some things get picked up and some things get dropped, and what gets transmitted and why?
Yeah, my first uh, inclination would be to infer that they were both working from a third independent text,
Mm-hmm.
which may not have had all the parts that each one of the daughter texts
Yeah.
includes, which were taken from further uh, independent texts. Um, but as to why something like the astrological rules may not have been transmitted, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, it's impossible to know at this point, really. Um, it like I say, it could be that a given author already had access to an alternative set of instructions that they found preferable for some reason.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just fascinating. I find again just you know the what sort of survives and what doesn't. And I suspect that as more manuscripts get published, we're going to be able to do really neat comparative stuff about, and maybe even get some stemata about how these manuscripts relate to each other. Although I'm doubtful. I'm not sure if you are, but I'm rather doubtful. I think that not many of them survive, and actually getting something like stemata is going to be maybe impossible. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, then again, it seems like new manuscripts are being discovered, year by year. So there may end up being more out there than we think there are.
Yeah, one could hope. I mean, yeah, there's still, maybe one can hope. And also, I think that what's interesting is I think many people just don't know that any of them survive. I think there's sort of a stereotype that the Inquisition or whatever burned everything and that nothing survives. But that's one that's not true. And ironically, I think people are often shocked to find out that when they did end up in the hands of the Inquisition, they were much more likely to survive.
Mm.
The Inquisition was much more likely to archive them for later use and later trials, as opposed to burning them. The Inquisition wasn't. The Dominicans were. The Inquisition wasn't much for book burning, which is again sort of a surprising thing to learn about them.
Yeah, I think that things like that, when they did happen, were more likely when justice was carried out at the local level.
Yeah, yeah, I think so too. I think so too, and that's what we also see with the witch trials, right? That if you're convicted as a witch, you're less likely to be executed if you're, because the Inquisition had a huge appellate system,
Mm.
as opposed to randomly in Germany where it was a local judge. You fared very poorly. Um, what's the most interesting material in the both in the section that you translated, But also, what's the most interesting material that you didn't translate to whet someone's palate to maybe do other translation work, or what was the most interesting material to you in the text?
Uh, of the part that I actually worked on, uh, I found the like I say the handbook of astrological necromancy uh really fascinating just because I'd really never seen anything quite like that
Hmm.
before. Um, uh, Determining when to summon a particular sort of demon based on which uh, zodiac sign the sun is in, and so on.
Right.
Um, as for the rest of the manuscript, I haven't taken a close look at the entire thing, but there are some pretty extensive sections on astrological talismanic magic,
Hmm.
similar to the kind of thing you would find in like the Picatrix, which I've always been kind of interested in that. Which uh, if I ever get around to it, it might be something I'd like to take a closer look at.
Yeah, that stuff is super fascinating. And the astrological magic also, I think of Michael Scott's commentaries, and Cecco d'Ascoli wrote his commentary on the major astrological textbook of the day. And that and his political shenanigans ultimately got him executed for sorcery in the 14th century. So that whole realm of astrological magic, astral necromancy, it's just super fascinating. Um, Again, anytime that we can do esotericism and then add more esotericism to it, so much better. It's like, you want some astrology? Here's some necromancy. You want some necromancy? Here's some Kabbalah. Here's some alchemy. Just throw it all in there. I always appreciate the turning it up to 11, so to speak, when it comes to this kind of stuff. So,
Chocolate and peanut butter.
yeah, exactly. Hey, man, the more again, it's like, why just do one kind of necromancy when you can really get yourself killed for all kinds?
Yeah.
And again, one does wonder about the ultimate, the identity of the person that, or persons, right? Because it seems like there are a couple different hands doing the copying here, and one wonders about what became of them.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly have no real idea. Uh, this manuscript I think is incredibly unique in giving a date and place of its final transcription.
Right, right.
Um, but beyond the fact that someone who was reasonably well educated in Latin and was living in Rome at the end of the 15th century, I can't really say.
Yeah, and I guess there's that the weird. There's a section there where they name gets dropped, Alexander, right? But we don't know if that's them. Probably not. They're just kind of copying the name.
Yeah, it seems more likely to me that's just something that was copied as part of that operation from a different source.
Right. Yeah. So we know that there was an Alexander the Necromancer out there, but yeah. I wonder how common Alexander was as a Latin name um,
Well,
in the Middle
aren't
Ages, or if it was a pseudonym.
aren't there a number of quasi magical texts that are allegedly attributed to Alexander the Great?
I think so. I wonder if they make their way all the way to the Middle Ages. I know that in the you see some of that stuff in earlier, but I wonder if that makes its way all the way to the Middle Ages.
I
And
wouldn't be surprised if it kind of floated around in folklore and then made its way back into the textual tradition.
it seems certainly possible. Certainly possible. Yeah, I think that the line between so-called folk magic and high magic, learned magic, I think that often that line is incredibly blurry.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, the Book of Oberon, for
right.
example.
No, exactly. I think that's the classic test case of a text that certainly combines those two worlds. You have any interest in tackling the rest of the manuscript? Or you're like, look, I did my fair share, but do you have any interest in tackling the rest of whatever 300 other folios or so?
Like I say, I mean, there are a few other segments that did look interesting, like the talismanic material. I mean, I would certainly like to at some point. Although you know, anybody out there who wants to take a crack at it, by all means, don't let me stop you. Um, like I say, my paleographic skills are casual at best, I guess. So frankly, a lot of the rest of the manuscript, at least right now, without putting in a lot of hours, is I feel like it's beyond me. Um,
And I think I mentioned this in the episode too, that part of what's really great about this manuscript is that because it's written in a Italian humanist hand, because our modern print is basically based on Italian humanist writing, it's much more legible than other manuscripts of the time that are written in textura quadrata or something like that. And so I think I mentioned in the episode that look, if you really want to crack your hand, at reading a medieval magical text, this is going to be probably the gateway drug, so to speak, to looking at these, because some of the other ones are so, the handwriting is just the cramped, abbreviated handwriting. And that's something I noticed about this text as well, is that despite the fact that the writer is clearly writing quite quickly at times, they don't really lapse that much into abbreviations, which is again really convenient for deciphering the thing.
yeah, I've done a little bit of work with the Summa Sacrae Magicae,
Mhm.
um, which it's a manuscript in the library of I think it's University of Kassel, and all kinds of often non-standardized abbreviations, practically every other word.
Yeah, it's
Um, yeah,
yeah, that stuff is nightmarish. And sometimes all you get is sort of, a bar here, a bar there, or just again, because I think a lot of these manuals, and you mentioned this in your introduction, these manuals they're manuals, they're meant to be used. And so a lot of the shorthand and a lot of the abbreviations are basically idiosyncratic to the person writing it, because they're not really writing it for anyone else. I mean, obviously, I mean, who are they going to share this with, right? Go, share it with their local priest or whatever. That might actually happen depending on what kind of priest they were. But yeah, I mean, these documents are being written for people to use, and therefore, just like if you're writing your own recipes down in your own recipe book, whatever abbreviation you use for sugar or pound may be just completely idiosyncratic to you.
right.
So, which makes people like your job a nightmare sometimes.
That's part
Um,
of the fun.
it is part of the fun. I mean, it's both kind of deciphering and then translating and transcribing. It's all the things, and then at the end of it, right, you're like, I mean, and again, I'm sure I've had the same experience. Sometimes you look at what you've translated and you're like, my God, this is really weird.
Yeah.
It's like you surprise yourself. You're like, wow, I just translated this really weird thing. Um, yeah, like, if you have to kill another dove, like,
Go right ahead.
yeah, go right ahead. Like, dude, what does this guy have, like a bunch of doves around? Like, or my favorite is the corpse foot. Just like, the default assumption is you have access to a corpse foot. It,
Well, I mean, the city gibbet is right down the street.
it's true. Yeah, I guess you could just go hack one off. I wonder. I mean, I guess you always hear these stories, right? That's just sort of the magical nature of criminal bodies, that
Hmm.
hacking bones off, limbs off, or things like that. So yeah, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, these people, they were living in a place and time where both animal and corpse parts were much more accessible than they are today.
It's true, and also just this is the thing I think about when it comes to the animal sacrifices in these documents, is that we have a very different relationship to animals now, and killing a dove would have been you know nothing for these folks, and I think we look at that now and think, oh my God, barbaric, but I think it's a
Yeah, I
different.
mean, at the time that was part of preparing dinner.
Yeah, right, right, yeah. um yeah, I guess when your wife comes in and you're like, oh, more dove blood, he must be doing the Michael Scott thing again. um or maybe not, maybe these guys were bachelors, or again in the lower orders of the priesthood, maybe they just were actually celibate anyway. um do you get a sense when you think about necromancy and sort of the general world of this manuscript, of the Munich manuscript, of the Rawlinson manuscript? Do you get a sense of how you might, we see this word, right, nigromantia, over and over again? Do you get a sense of how that word might be being used, right? That because obviously stricto sensu, it's not necromancy in the sense of using dead people to divine the future. But do you get a sense of, from doing your translation work and other kinds of things, that you get a sense of what these folks meant by it?
Uh, as far as it actually shows up in the texts, it does seem to be kind of the the vernacular uh definition of necromancy at the time. So more or less malefic magic performed through the agency of spirits,
Mhm.
more or less. That seems to be the context in which they're using it. Although, oddly enough, the Michael Scott experiment really is actual necromancy. It's
Right.
contacting a ghost to get information.
Right. That's actually right.
Uh,
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
yeah, so I putting those two things together, that's kind of how I came up with the title for the book. It's both kinds of necromancy.
Oh, right, right, right. Yeah. And again, that's also interesting, right? Because we have this idea of we see that also in other manuscripts as well. This idea of using demons to extract the spirits of dead people to get the dead people to teach you stuff.
Right.
You see this in other manuscripts as well. Again, that mechanism is quite fascinating. When you talk about, I introduced you earlier, right? And you're looking at sort of the worldview of these folks. What do you think is the most surprising thing that people might learn about the worldview of a medieval necromancer? Like, what kinds of things have you noticed that jump out to you as interesting or surprising as what we might learn about these folks?
Well, and I think this is something that you did touch upon in your previous video, that the um the the cosmology that lies behind operative magic in this period is very much the a Christian one.
Mhm.
Um, and not only in terms of the agents of the magic, which are the devils of Christian demonology, which are often derived from ancient pagan deities in one form or another, but also in the operative sense that the invocations themselves are more or less modeled on the Catholic rite of exorcism.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think this is a thing that people don't really appreciate as much as they might want or not want, I guess, depending on what perspective they take, is that the necromancers are Christians. I think that's
Mm.
like a thing that's really, I think, shocking to people. I think it's both shocking to people now who might identify as necromancers, people who are practitioners of what sometimes gets called the left hand path now, and also Christians, right? Christians, I think, will go, "You can't be a Christian or necromancer," and I think the necromancers will go, "You can't be a necromancer and a Christian." Neither one want to admit that neither one at some level could admit that either of them only exist uh, because of they share a common ancestor in some sense, which I find to be fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, again, at the time, in medieval Western Europe, anyone who was going to have access to these kinds of texts was almost necessarily going to be at least nominally a Christian.
Mhm.
They would have had to go through the uh, the curriculum of some type of ecclesiastically backed education system. Um, and like I say, the the Christian cosmology was just kind of the uh, common background uh, for the worldview in that context.
Right. I guess there's not much of another. I mean, it's not like there's a marketplace of religions out there where you can pick up, like, I'm going to pick up a Babylonian worldview and practice the Maklu ritual. You can't really do that in the Middle Ages. There's Christian hegemony really is. When we say hegemony, we really should, with the exception of some random Jewish people out there, it's really a Christian world. And if you're going to do anything, magic or otherwise, that's basically the worldview that you would have to adopt because there isn't really much of another worldview out there. I guess maybe aside some astral stuff coming in from Picatrix in the Arab world, but that's still it's still getting reframed, of course, into a Christian cultural system. Um,
There's nothing particularly Islamic about it.
right? No, no, no. I don't think so. Um, yeah, in fact, the Picatrix may have come out of a world that wasn't particularly Islamic itself. It may have come from this sort of Sabaean world of like things like the Nabatean agriculture that are not they themselves enter into the Islamic context from another religious system.
Hmm.
And again, this gives us maybe a bit to talk about that this whole idea of the so-called clerical necromantic underground, which is one of my just sounds like one of the best band names ever. From your research and from your work, how big do you think it was? How when you think about when we think about the sort of the Italianate Latin that finds its way into the German manuscript and into the Munich manuscript, right? And that's maybe telling us, right, this stuff is coming in from Italy, and we have lots of reasons to believe that similar kinds of texts, like the Solomonic magic's also coming into Italy, perhaps from the Byzantine context and things like that. Um, what do you again? How vast do you think this was? It's you don't want to. I don't think we want to lapse into conspiracy theory. There was a vast network of underground necromancers within the Catholic Church, but it had to be more than nothing to get these texts from town to town, from copier to copier, from practitioner to practitioner. It had to be robust enough. Do you get any ideas or any thoughts on how thick of a layer that was in society?
Yeah, it's hard to say how many practitioners there may have been in absolute numbers, but uh, as far as the geographic scale of this kind of network, I mean, like I say, it literally stretched from England to Rome.
Right.
Um, and but when you think about it, it's not that surprising because I mean, there were envoys traveling between the courts of Europe and the Pope on a practically yearly basis. I mean that's how the mail got around. Um, so I think it's entirely plausible that these disparate practitioners would have at least been able to uh, strike up some kind of a long distance a long distance correspondence with a pen pal with similar interests.
Yeah,
Um,
I wonder how they would. This is such an interesting thing. I wonder how they would know because it's not like the kind of thing you like put up an ad being like necromancer seeking necromancer. Please inquire. I'm looking for necromantic manuals on Craigslist. I can't imagine it goes that way, but I wonder how one. Sometimes you see things. How do you know one to be one, right? How would you know in the papal envoy that because it's not like they're like goths, right? They're like it's like, oh, that's the necromancer, like their faces painted white with corpse paint, and you're like, that must be the papal necromancer. um but one wonders how you would even get tipped off to you know these guys, because again, we do know of trial records of people being executed for this kind of thing, and so it wasn't like it was a safe business to be exchanging these ideas, exchanging these manuscripts, practicing this stuff. And one wonders how you, if you showed up in England as the papal envoy and you were a part of this clerical necromantic movement, or system or whatever, how would the English guy know that you were the guy to get the goods from? I don't know. I guess the same with like people, go to a new town and find drug dealers. It must be something. I've just sort of the material way this happened. I'm always curious about. Any thoughts?
yeah, I mean, it's not something I've thought a lot about, but now that you mention it, it could have been something as simple as making an offhand reference to like what would have been the incipit of one of these texts, uh, like saying something like, Oh, does your library have a copy of the Vinculum Solomonus? And I mean, and that's not incriminating.
Right. Right. Yeah. I guess as long as like the Clavicula Salomonis, and the librarian's like, what do you want that for? Um, it's like going into the library, like, do you have a copy of the Anarchist Cookbook? They're like, I don't know, let me call the FBI. Um, uh, yeah, I wonder, like if it's sort of at the librarian level. Um, yeah, I think this is interesting. This is, to me, that's one of the really interesting parts of all this. Is also the material culture part of this. How much money is it costing these guys to, how much did the Munich Necromancer's Manual cost to get produced? You look at some records, right, from at least the 14th century, you look at some of these records where it's a couple pence a day for an average roofer, right? And then you look at the price of sort of books being sold, and you're looking at books that are 2 months' wages for at least commoners' wages, right? Sort of day laborers' wages, people, but skilled labor. Thatchers are still skilled labor. And so 2 months of skilled labor for a relatively small, non-illuminated, octavo-sized text, which is roughly the same size as CL 849. I can't remember how big the Medici text is, but there must be some serious investment. I mean, this is no cheap affair. And so one wonders, right? Like, are they getting money from patrons? Are some of the Medicis maybe interested, or, do they have patrons who are interested in stuff and they want plausible deniability, so they pin it on the necromancer if the necromancer gets pinched. So you don't get, I just wonder. I wonder how much this stuff cost, and um, who's doing the copying, and how do you not get caught when you go, because you can't take it to a scriptorium and say, hey, can you copy this Michael Scott experiment? And they're like, we can turn you over to the Inquisition. But I wonder, any thoughts on how you think this kind of thing went down?
Yeah, I mean, like the Medici text clearly was not produced in a scriptorium.
No.
This was somebody scribbling in a back room somewhere. Um, but yeah, as far as how much it would have I mean, the cost would have been purely in terms of acquiring the blank book itself, and it is paper rather than parchment,
Right.
which would have also cut down on the price. But I mean, it's not something I've researched really. I haven't looked into how much a large blank paper book would have cost in 15th century Italy.
Yeah, and I wonder if it's been rebound, if the binding that we have now, that the binding, because I wonder if that binding is contemporary, or was it rebound later, or because you can see the paper is not high quality. Some pages of it are really nice, and some pages of it you can see the ink is just feathering like crazy. And that's usually a sign of really uneven paper quality, or someone in a real hurry writing, or both.
Mhm.
But yeah, I wonder if this is the kind of thing that, if I had time and money and energy, I would love to look at these individual necromancers manuals and try to get some sense of what's the material aspect of what it takes. How long does it take to copy this? What does it take? What's the cost involved? And I think this is another thing that belies the whole idea that medieval people didn't believe in this stuff. Like, you don't go through all that effort if you don't, and correct it, right?
Yeah.
Without doing it, without believing in it, without really risking your neck in some level to make it work.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, you don't go back and make annotations about what specific kind of incense you should be using if you hadn't tried it first and it didn't work. I don't
Right.
think.
Right. Or if you can't get that because it's so expensive, right? That
Yes.
you have to, again, same with like vanilla, right? Like, you go bake cookies and you're like, am I really going to buy a real vanilla? Imitation vanilla, right? Like, you're going to, you might have to cut corners to make some of this stuff work. And, that's one of the other sort of material side of this is like, you're going to use this incense or the other one that you can get at Costco for a little cheaper.
Yeah, exactly.
So, well, man, where can people find you? Where can people find your book? Where can people get in touch with you? Independent scholars, I know, at least in my experience, are always looking for a good paying job and good work. So I will say that I've been really impressed with this text. I really enjoy it as a person who looks at a lot of this kind of literature there's a lot of unevenness in the world of sort of these kinds of texts, and I really was impressed with your work, and it's learning that you're self-taught. Yeah, kudos to you, man. This is just a fine text, and I really appreciate the work you've done. But where can people find you? Where can people employ you? Where can people can get in touch with you? Buy your book.
Well, first of all, I'm glad you enjoyed the book. Um, uh, my professional website is bjohnsonfreelance.com. Uh, if anyone has any need for a translator, humanities research consultant, or copy editor, they can get in touch with me through the form on that site. Possibly the more interesting part of the website is my list of publications, where you can find all of my previous articles, uh, most or all of which are available open access to read online. Um, I can also be contacted through my Twitter account, which is at JOHBRI. It's my last name and first name backwards. Um, and all of my books can be purchased directly from the publisher, HadeanPress.com, or any other online bookseller that you prefer to use.
And I will say that I will also want to thank Haiti and Press and you, Brian, for offering me early access to this in PDF. Sorry I couldn't get to it earlier to take advantage of that, but now that I have the paper copy in front of me, and also I think they have a hardbound copy too, right, at Haiti and Press.
Yes, which will it's been on pre-order for some time. There've been a number of delays at the printer for various reasons, but I'm I off the top of my head, I'm not sure. It may still be available to pre-order. But in any case, we'll be going on sale uh at notionally at this point, early next month.
Great, great. Well, Brian, I just want to really, again, express my gratitude. I've done translation work, I've done paleographic work. I know how much of a pain it is. And so I just want to, again, express my gratitude for making a chunk of this really important, really interesting cultural artifacts, whether it's magic or otherwise, available to folks, and also available to folks at a reasonable price. This book is less than $20 American, which is an incredibly reasonable price considering how much some of this academic publications go for. So thanks for making that available. And folks, definitely go take a look at Brian's website. Make sure to pick up a copy of this book and his other texts as well. And yeah, get in touch with him. And I just want to thank you again, Brian, for taking the time to hang out with me and chat about necromancy on a random Wednesday afternoon, as we do here at Esoterica. But thank you again so much for your work, and thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the conversation between Brian and I. I really had a lot of fun talking to him and really going through some of the ins and outs of translating just in general medieval manuscripts, but also specifically the unique challenges that come along with translating books of magic or necromantic tomes. If you're curious about this, I've actually done an entire episode just on what it takes to decipher a really complicated, heavily abbreviated necromantic text, the Munich Necromancer's Manual, CLM 849. I'll include a link to that in the card above if you want to check out that very line-by-line work of doing that kind of translation work. Otherwise, thank you for watching this episode. Thank you for watching this interview. And if you'd like to support my work, please consider becoming a supporter on Patreon or with a one-time donation. Thank you. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.